Michael had owned his above-ground pool for 5 summers now. While it had provided countless hours of relief during scorching July afternoons, the maintenance had become increasingly burdensome. Between the chemical balancing, cleaning, and the growing crack along the liner that threatened to burst at any moment, Michael decided it was time to reclaim his backyard. Standing at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, Michael gazed out at the 18-foot circle of faded blue vinyl that dominated his modest yard. What had once been a source of joy had become a weekend-consuming chore. Last Saturday alone, he spent 4 hours skimming leaves, adjusting chlorine levels, and attempting to patch that worrisome crack for the 3rd time this season. The temporary repair had already begun to bubble. At 42, with his 2 children now in their late teens and more interested in hanging out with friends than splashing in the backyard, the pool's appeal had diminished significantly. Emma, his 19-year-old, hadn't dipped a toe in the water all summer, and 17-year-old Jake had used it exactly twice, both times to impress a girl from his chemistry class. The novelty had long worn off. Michael scrolled through his phone, checking his bank balance. The $1,200 estimate for the pool's removal wasn't insignificant, but neither was the $800 he spent annually on chemicals, new equipment, and rising water bills. Not to mention the increase in his homeowner's insurance for having the attractive nuisance in his yard. The math made his decision clearer. "Have you finally decided?" his wife Sarah asked, joining him at the window. She'd been advocating for the pool's removal since last August, when a particularly vicious storm had caused the water to turn a mysterious shade of green that took 3 weeks and $200 worth of shock treatment to correct. "I think it's time," Michael nodded, showing her the removal company's website on his phone. "They can do it next weekend." Sarah's face brightened. "Think of the garden we could put in that space, or maybe one of those fire pit areas with the nice chairs, the kind we saw at the Johnson's place." As they discussed possibilities, Michael felt a weight lifting. The pool had been his idea originally, a compromise when they couldn't afford the family vacation to Florida that the kids had desperately wanted. It had served its purpose, creating 5 summers of memories, water fights, and neighborhood barbecues. But everything had its season. After careful consideration, he scheduled the pool's removal for the coming weekend, looking forward to the extra space and reduced responsibilities. He even began sketching potential layouts for the reclaimed area, envisioning a space that would better suit their family's current lifestyle. Perhaps a garden for Sarah, a spot for grilling, and comfortable seating for those increasingly frequent evenings when their now older children actually wanted to sit and talk with them. That night, as Michael set up the automatic pool cleaner for one of its final runs, he felt no regret, only anticipation for the simpler, lower-maintenance future ahead. Being considerate, Michael mentioned his plans to his immediate neighbors. It seemed like the right thing to do, given that the removal would involve a large truck, workers coming and going, and probably more noise than was typical for their quiet cul-de-sac. On Wednesday evening, he made his rounds, casually informing everyone within earshot of the upcoming weekend activity. The Wilsons next door simply nodded, Dave mumbling something about one less mosquito breeding ground, while his wife Elena expressed mild interest in what would replace it. The retired couple across the street, the Chens, barely looked up from their gardening to acknowledge the news with a polite wave. The Rodriguezes, whose children occasionally joined Michael's kids for supervised swims years ago, seemed genuinely sorry to see it go, but understood completely. "Those things are money pits," George said with knowing sympathy, having removed his own pool the previous summer. Most neighbors responded with casual acknowledgement until Michael reached Diane Henderson's house 3 doors down. He almost skipped her home entirely, as they had barely exchanged more than passing greetings over the years. The Hendersons had moved into the neighborhood about 18 months ago, and while they attended the obligatory community events, it largely kept to themselves. Michael had occasionally noticed Diane watching from her front window as neighbors interacted, but she rarely joined the informal gatherings that sometimes formed on pleasant evenings. "You're doing what?" Diane asked, her voice rising an octave as she stood in her doorway. Her previously neutral expression transformed into something between shock and indignation. "Just removing my pool," Michael repeated, confused by her intensity. "The company's coming Saturday. I wanted to give everyone a heads up about the noise and—" "You can't take down your pool," she insisted, folding her arms across her chest. Her posture stiffened as though preparing for battle. "My kids swim there all the time." Michael was momentarily speechless, blinking twice as he processed her words. Tyler and Madison Henderson were around 12 and 9, if he remembered correctly. Polite but quiet children who were typically seen being shuttled between various after-school activities in Diane's immaculately clean SUV. Not once had they ever been invited to use his pool. In fact, he couldn't recall ever seeing them in his yard. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion." Michael finally managed, trying to keep his tone gentle. "My pool has only been used by my family and occasionally some friends when we're hosting." Diane's eyes narrowed. "Last summer," she said with the conviction of someone stating an irrefutable fact. "When you were away on your business trip, we used it every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon." A vague uneasiness settled in Michael's stomach. He had taken a 2-week trip to Phoenix last August for a conference and training. Sarah had stayed with her sister during that time, and they'd hired Kevin, a college student and son of a friend, to house sit and take care of the basic pool maintenance. "I wasn't aware of any arrangement," Michael said carefully, increasingly certain there had been a misunderstanding, or worse, an unauthorized use of his property. "But regardless, we decided it's time for the pool to go." Diane's face flushed slightly. "We'll see about that," she muttered before abruptly closing the door. Walking home, Michael felt the pleasant evening somewhat tainted by the bizarre encounter. He pulled out his phone to text Sarah. "We might have a problem, the pool removal. You won't believe what just happened." 2 days before the scheduled removal, Michael returned home from work to find a handwritten note taped to his front door. The pale blue stationery was folded precisely, secured with a piece of clear tape that caught the afternoon sunlight. Curious, he peeled it off and unfolded it while walking inside. The contents stopped him mid-stride. In surprisingly formal language, written in meticulous cursive, Diane hereby notified him that removing the pool would constitute a breach of neighborhood expectations and demanded he reconsider his hasty and community-damaging decision. The note continued for a full page, referencing established patterns of usage and reasonable expectations of continuity, as though she were drafting a legal document rather than a neighborly communication. "You've got to be kidding me," Michael muttered, reading it twice to ensure he wasn't misinterpreting. The note concluded with a thinly veiled threat about pursuing all available remedies if he proceeded with the removal. Michael crumpled the note, equal parts confused and irritated, and smoothed it out again to show Sarah when she got home from her shift at the hospital. He took a photo and sent it to Kevin, the house sitter from last summer, with a simple question. "Did you let neighbors use our pool when we were away?" Kevin's response came quickly. "Mr. Larson, I'm really sorry. The neighbor lady said you had an arrangement. She seemed so certain and her kids were so excited about swimming lessons. She said Tuesdays and Thursdays were the usual days. I should have checked with you directly." Michael sighed, piecing together the situation. One misunderstanding last summer had apparently created a sense of entitlement that defied all logic. That evening, while he and Sarah were discussing how to handle the situation over dinner, his phone lit up with messages from other neighbors. Dave Wilson texted first, "Hey Mike, what's this about you promising pool access to the neighborhood kids? Henderson woman just left our porch." Then came a message from Alina Wilson, "Just checking if you're okay. Diane seems unusually invested in your pool. She's telling everyone her children have swimming lessons scheduled there next week." George Rodriguez called directly, "Man, there's a crazy lady going door to door about your pool. Just wanted to warn you. She's saying something about community property and broken promises." Even the usually private Chen sent a text, "Neighbor making unusual claims about your pool. Wanted you to know. Diane's apparently working her way through the neighborhood, rallying support for her cause, claiming her children would be devastated by the loss of their summer swimming spot." According to various reports filtering in, she had embellished the story with each telling. By the time she reached the far end of the cul-de-sac, Michael had apparently promised swimming lessons for the entire neighborhood and hosted regular weekend pool parties that brought the community together. "This is getting out of hand," Sarah said, reading the latest message over Michael's shoulder. "Should we postpone the removal until this blows over?" Michael shook his head firmly. "The crew is booked for Saturday. The deposit is non-refundable." And more importantly, he added, his irritation growing, "It's our yard and our decision. I'm not letting someone else's delusion dictate what we do with our property." As if on cue, another text arrived, this time from the removal company confirming Saturday's appointment. Michael responded with a firm confirmation and silenced his phone for the evening, determined not to let Diane's bizarre campaign derail their plans. On Saturday morning, Michael rose early, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety churning in his stomach. The pool removal crew was scheduled to arrive at 8:00 a.m. By 7:30, he had already drained the remaining water, disconnected the pump and filter system, and was moving the patio furniture to make room for the workers. Sarah brought in coffee on the back deck. "Think she'll actually try something?" she asked, leaning against the railing. "I honestly have no idea," Michael replied, scanning the surrounding yards. The neighborhood was quiet, still waking up to the weekend, but I'm not changing our plans either way. At precisely 8:00, a truck with Marshall's Pool Services painted on the side pulled into their driveway. 3 workers in matching gray t-shirts introduced themselves and began surveying the job. Michael was explaining the access path to the backyard when movement across the street caught his attention. Diane was marching purposefully toward his house, her 2 children in tow. Tyler and Madison, looking thoroughly uncomfortable in their matching swim attire with towels draped around their shoulders, followed several steps behind their mother. The boy kept his eyes firmly on the ground while the girl cast apologetic glances toward the neighboring houses, her cheeks flushed with obvious embarrassment. "Mr. Larson," Diane called out, her voice carrying across the morning air. Several curtains twitched in nearby windows as neighbors detected the brewing confrontation. "I see you've decided to ignore the community's wishes." Michael took a deep breath, determined to remain calm. "Good morning, Diane. As I mentioned earlier this week, we're removing our pool today." Diane positioned herself between the workers and the side gate that led to the backyard, her children reluctantly standing behind her. "This is community property by now," she declared loudly, as if addressing an audience rather than just Michael. "My children have swimming lessons scheduled here next week. You've already paid the instructor." The workers exchanged bewildered glances while Michael tried to process the sheer absurdity of her claim. One of the crew members, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard, scratched his head. Sir, is there an issue with the property rights here?" "No," Michael stated firmly. "This is my property. The pool is mine to remove." "We have an established agreement," Diane insisted, pulling a folder from her large purse. "I have documentation of our arrangement from last summer, signed by your representative." Michael felt a flash of disbelief as she produced a wrinkled paper with what appeared to be Kevin's signature at the bottom. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to gather at the edges of his property, some clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding drama, others seemingly entertained by this Saturday morning spectacle. "Kevin was a house sitter, not a representative, with the authority to grant permanent access to my property," Michael explained, struggling to maintain his composure. "Mom," Madison whispered, tugging at Diane's sleeve, "this is really embarrassing. Can we please go home?" Diane ignored her daughter's plea, instead raising her voice further. "The children of this community have come to rely on this amenity. You have a social obligation, Mr. Larson." By now, at least a dozen neighbors had gathered on the periphery, watching the confrontation with expressions ranging from confusion to secondhand embarrassment. The pool crew stood awkwardly by their truck, clearly unsure whether to proceed. Sarah stepped forward, her hospital conflict resolution training kicking in. "Diane, I understand you're upset, but this is creating a difficult situation for everyone, especially your children." She nodded toward Tyler and Madison, who seemed to be trying to make themselves as small as possible behind their mother. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately, without an audience." As the standoff continued, the tension in Michael's front yard grew palpable. Diane stood with her arms crossed, her children fidgeting uncomfortably behind her, while the pool removal crew remained by their truck, clearly uncertain how to proceed. Neighbors had formed a loose semicircle, watching the drama unfold with varying degrees of interest. Sarah's attempt at de-escalation had been met with dismissal from Diane, who seemed determined to make her stand as public as possible. "This isn't a private matter," she had insisted. "This affects the whole neighborhood." One of the neighbors, Tom Reeves, a retired high school principal who lived at the corner house, approached Michael quietly. Tom had always been the unofficial diplomat of the cul-de-sac, the reasonable voice who helped mediate when issues arose between residents. "Can I have a word?" Tom asked, gesturing Michael a few steps away from the group. Michael nodded, grateful for the momentary reprieve from Diane's increasingly theatrical proclamations about community rights and established custom. "You know she's been telling everyone she had a standing arrangement with you, right?" Tom said in a low voice, his bushy gray eyebrows drawn together in concern. "That you offered your pool as the neighborhood swimming spot last summer when you were away on business. She's been quite specific about it. Tuesdays and Thursdays from 3 to 5, apparently." Suddenly the pieces clicked into place. Michael felt a rush of clarity, like solving a puzzle whose pieces had been scattered. "I was in Phoenix for 2 weeks last August for work," Michael explained. "We hired Kevin, a college student, to house sit. He took care of the basics: male plants, pool chemicals." He shook his head in disbelief. "But I never authorized anyone else to use the pool, especially not when we weren't home." "The liability alone." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "From what I gather, this Kevin fellow might have been a bit overwhelmed by Diane's persistence. You know how she can be. She has a way of making it seem like you already agreed to something." During Michael's 2-week vacation the previous summer, he hired the house sitter, who apparently had been more generous with his property than authorized. The text messages from Kevin now make complete sense. Diane had likely convinced the young man that there was a pre-existing arrangement, and he, not wanting to cause problems, had acquiesced. "The thing is," Tom continued, lowering his voice further, "I've noticed her children at your pool more than just those 2 weeks. Several times last summer, even when your car was in the driveway. Usually when you weren't visible from the street." Michael felt a chill despite the morning warmth. Had Diane been allowing her children to use his pool even when Kevin wasn't there to grant permission? The safety implications were horrifying. "And from what Madison let slip at our community picnic last month," Tom added, Diane's been telling some of the other parents that you've offered swimming lessons this summer. She's been collecting $20 per child for what she calls pool maintenance fees. Michael's jaw dropped. Diane had been operating under the assumption that the informal access granted during those 2 weeks constituted a permanent arrangement, and apparently had been monetizing it. She wasn't just entitled, she was potentially committing fraud by collecting money for access to his property without his knowledge or consent. He turned back toward the confrontation with fresh understanding and growing anger. What had seemed merely absurd now appeared potentially criminal. With the removal temporarily paused, Michael took a deep breath and returned to face Diane. The revelation of her potential scam had transformed his irritation into controlled anger, but he knew a public confrontation would only make matters worse. "I think we all need to discuss this properly," Michael announced, addressing not just Diane but the gathered neighbors as well. "Since this apparently involves the neighborhood, let's have a proper conversation about it." He gestured toward his driveway, which was wide enough to accommodate the impromptu gathering. The pool crew, looking relieved at the brief respite, retreated to their truck to wait. Several of the neighbors, curious about the resolution, moved closer. "I don't see what there is to discuss," Diane insisted, though her confidence seemed slightly diminished by the shifting dynamics. "We had an agreement." Michael calmly explained this situation to everyone, clarifying that there had never been any agreement, implied or otherwise, about neighborhood pool access. He described his business trip last summer and the limited role of the house sitter, careful not to throw Kevin under the bus while still making it clear that any permission granted had been unauthorized and temporary. Kevin was hired to maintain the pool, not to open it for public use, Michael explained. He was a college student doing a favor for a family friend, not a property manager with authority to grant ongoing access rights. Several neighbors nodded sympathetically, while Diane's face flushed crimson. Alina Wilson, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Diane, did you really collect money from families for swimming lessons at Michael's pool?" she asked directly, her tone more curious than accusatory. The sudden question caught Diane off guard. She clutched her folder tighter. "It was for chemicals and maintenance expenses," she stammered, "since we were using the facility regularly." "Without the owner's knowledge or consent," George Rodriguez pointed out. "That's not how neighborhoods work, Senora." When Michael produced documentation of the pool's structural damage and the liability it now posed, the tide of opinion visibly shifted. He pulled out his phone and showed several close-up photos of the crack in the liner, explaining how a catastrophic failure could result in thousands of gallons of water suddenly flooding nearby properties. "That crack is right along the section facing the Wilsons' yard," he pointed out. "If it gave way completely, the water damage could be extensive." Dave Wilson's eyebrows shot up. "That's less than 20 feet from our new landscaping," he noted with concern. Even Diane's husband, Richard, who had appeared midway through the discussion looking harried and confused, seemed mortified by his wife's behavior. "Diane, you told me Michael had explicitly offered the pool," he said quietly, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You said it was a neighborhood arrangement." "He did," Diane insisted, but her voice had lost its earlier conviction. His house sitter said, a 20-year-old college student without authority to make such arrangements, Richard finished for her, his embarrassment evident. He turned to Michael. "I'm very sorry about this. I had no idea." Madison, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Mom, you promised we'd get our own pool if we saved up enough allowance money," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That's why we've been doing extra chores." The revelation hung in the air, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Diane had apparently been promising her children their own pool, possibly using the maintenance fees toward that goal, while using Michael's pool in the meantime.